Trouble's going. She's gone. Go London.
Change ringing is a style of church bell ringing that arose in Renaissance England. Different countries have different traditions of how church bells are rung. This is the one that's peculiarly English. It requires bells hung in a particular way so that they can swing 360 degrees.
You have the bell, and the first thing you notice is a wheel that goes around. That is called the bell wheel. It has, I don't know, 5 or 6 or 7 spokes to it, and that is the thing. A rope is fastened to that, and when you pull on the rope, it rocks the bell. Now, the way the wheel is attached to the bell is perhaps the next thing. There is a yoke-like device that is called a headstock. It's scooped up, curved in the middle, and the bell is bolted up to that in some way or another. And then it has a couple of axle pins that go in bearings, nowadays ball bearings. And these bearings are fastened down to steel beams that go along in the direction that the bell would swing. And up in the tower, there's a whole grid or framework of either wood or, as I say nowadays, steel beam, in which all of your bells are set.
There are ropes coming through holes in the ceiling. Typically, there's another level above that, which is just dead space to give a little bit of length to the ropes, and eventually get up to a level where there are the bells, usually called the bell chamber or the belfry.
Most bells that you see rung in just any old church, they just go back and forth. They go bang, 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 bang. You might have 2 or 3 of them doing this, but they just clatter, and it's lovely. But you can't control when the clattering is going to occur. That's what's different about change ringing bells from just ordinary church bells. The fact that you can put them upside down, or up, as we say, and stop them there. What allows you to do this is a device called, 2 devices, one called a stay and another a slider. Those are the things that prevent the bell from completely overturning, and they allow you to set the bell to stop it when it's upside down, and then ring it when you want to. There are some very good ringers who can control a bell so well that they never have to, the stay never bumps the slider underneath. They can check the balance, they can check the rope, the swing of the bell when it's just at the top, and just hold it at that balance point without it ever touching the stay and the slider, and then ring it and stop it and so on. You got to be good to do that.
It's very difficult to control a bell. It's very sensitive to how hard you pulled the last time, exactly how you're controlling the bell. It's also difficult to hear exactly what's going on. You need to be listening to the greater sound, and it takes a long time to acquire that. That's a very difficult skill.
So 10, 11, what's good for you? After lunch?
Whatever. We're going to be with you for a little while.
There you go, very good.
Might as well enjoy yourself. Thank you.
Learning to ring is a fairly lengthy and complicated task. There are several different sets of skills you need to learn. The first one is simply to physically control the bell. This is fairly challenging. You've got potentially a ton of bell metal 2 stories over your head that you're swinging through 360 degrees on the end of a rope you can only pull on, you can't push on. There are 2 distinct strokes depending on which way the bell is turning. One involves hanging onto the end of the rope, and one involves hanging onto a tufted piece of wool in the middle of the rope called the sally. And so we'll generally teach those 2 halves separately, then we'll combine them. And it takes a long time for someone to learn exactly how hard to pull, where to catch.
Okay, this one's yours.
Yeah, that was too high. Grabbed it quicker. That was just right, so you didn't bounce, I don't know, a little bit too high, but you grabbed it quicker, so you had it under control.
Once I was able to ring both parts of the stroke together, I felt as though I could actually make progress and learn.
And then the next stage is when you start ringing rounds with some other people. You might start ringing rounds on 4, so there are only 3 other bells. And at the Advent or Old North Church, you then progress to ringing rounds on 8.
Rounds are the bells rung in order, from the lightest one to the heaviest one, over and over again.
You might think that was very boring, you know, but it isn't very boring really, because first of all it's a nice sound, rounds, and second you can ring on different bells, you see. So you work up your listening and your physical skills by just ringing something simple. It takes a while to actually learn to handle a bell, and then it takes a while to actually be able to make a decent sound, and then you're ready to start change ringing. When you start ringing changes, it's a new world completely.
When bells start changing position with respect to each other, they typically do it according to a pattern called a method. This is a pattern where every bell, or nearly every bell, does the same thing, just starting in a different place. It's a lot like weaving, or how strands might be braided together, where everybody does pretty much the same thing, often just a straight line going through the others, but each one starting in a slightly different place, so they wrap around and you have a repeating pattern.
Go, Cambridge Minor!
Then once you've more or less mastered staying exactly in the right timing in rounds, then you start learning to do what's called plain hunt. Plain hunt is the simplest method, where each of the bells moves one position at every stroke.
You're always either speeding up to be further and further up in the order of bells, or slowing down to be later and later and later.
If I was starting out ringing in first place, then after the tower captain or the conductor calls go plain hunt on 6, my next blow would be in second place, and then my next blow would be in thirds, the next one in fourths, and so on.
Eventually you start learning how to ring in patterns with others. There's some tremendous skills to be learned here in understanding where you are with respect to other people.
It's also visual. You try and be after someone visually, which usually means your hands come down about this far after theirs. That usually sounds about right. But then you correct things by listening to it. The actual sound is so much later than the action that you can't ring only by sound. You also have to ring by watching people. Because by the time you've done this, it's about 2 seconds later you actually hear the bong. And by that point, you can't make any corrections. Like, okay, that was bad. Don't do that next time. Acquiring
this sense of where you are with respect to other bells by using both your ears and your eyes is often called rope sight. It takes a while. It's generally several years before someone is comfortable ringing well with other people. And then we start learning even more complicated patterns.
And then the next time, we could try having the 3 and the 4 and the 5 and 6, which means you'll just ring. You take the 5?
Sure.
Okay. 4 blows in 6th place, and 4 blows in 5th place, and 4 blows in 6th place, and 4 blows until I tell you.
I've done class.
Okay. Okay. I can remember what you had. More bodies, please.
When you have a bunch of people ringing together, typically one of them will be designated the conductor. There's a basic pattern we ring called the method, and we have more complicated ways of putting it together by occasionally making what's called a call. For this, the conductor will pretty much grunt a word bob or single, which instructs 2 or 3 ringers to do something slightly different than they would, essentially trade places in the pattern they're ringing.
And you never know how they're going to be combined until the conductor says, ring this now. And a split second later, you have to start ringing that, and you have to switch what you're doing. And it's really hard And we're just about at the point where we can do that solidly here if everyone shows up who's good at it.
But you can do it, you just practice. Ear and eye, yeah. And have the privilege of ringing with 15 other people that know how to do it.
Like many of the basic trappings of civilization, tea cozies, parliamentary democracy, and Lord Peter Wimsey the Sleuth himself, for instance, change ringing is an English invention, an arcane, incredibly English preoccupation. But it does travel, if not far. Boston's Old North Church. Paul Revere rang changes here. The Church of the Advent at the foot of Beacon Hill.
The British liked their church service, and they were used to having an organ, and they were used to having bells. And so they had a public subscription and raised the money for the bells. They were cast in 1744 in Bell Lane, Gloucester, as a maiden peal.
They were actually brought over for free on a sailing ship because they served as such good ballast. And the records of that sailing ship are really the only reason we even know what the bells weigh. They were installed in the tower in 1745, and a band established rules 5 years later, and it included Paul Revere as one of the original ringers there.
And there is in Old North a copy of the contract that he signed with 7 other young men to ring, and there's a legend that he knew about the tower because of his involvement with the bells.
When the current building of the Church of the Advent was built in the end of the 19th century, some interest arose about putting change ringing bells in, and a family named Codman donated money to establish change ringing bells at the Advent. They were installed in 1900.
There was a great deal of interest in them when they were first hung, because there were enough Anglophiles or English people living here to ring them. But then there began to be trouble with the neighbors, and they just stopped ringing them. And so they just moldered.
It's not uncommon for a tower to be silent for a long time, and then suddenly someone gets very interested and creates enough enthusiasm that a whole new band starts again.
Chemistry professor Jeffrey Davies fell in love with the sound of bells as a child in England. 6 years ago, he first climbed up to the bell chamber of Boston's Church of the Advent to examine the 8-bell ring in the tower that had been silent for over 50 years. He found the chamber had been left open to the elements during that half-century, and the bells were badly in disrepair. It was his enthusiasm and that of a guild of bell ringers he had organized that finally prompted the church to have the bells rehung and to make the ringing a regular part of church activities.
When I'd only been here for about a year, the senior warden at the Church of the Advent called me and asked me if I'd go and have a look at the bells. And so Doug Brown and myself were the first people to actually go and see the state of affairs in the ringing room and above where the bells were.
The bells had just stopped being rung. There wasn't anything the matter with them. The place needed to be swept out because the pigeons had been there. That's the place where the rector, whose name was Harris Collingwood, organized what he called the Guano Guild.
When Doug thought it was okay to try one of the bells, we tried to ring one of the bells up, and the 2 of us couldn't do it. The frame moved so much, and the bells needed oiling every time because they were on plain bearings, and so we nearly killed ourselves trying to get one of the bells up, and it looked very, very grim. So I didn't think, we'd be able to do anything, but after thinking about it again, I decided I'd give it a go. And so we started recruiting ringers from the congregation. And from 1972 to 1975, I must have taught a lot of people to ring. Some people couldn't do it because they weren't strong enough. We weren't ringing anything complicated. We just wanted to ring the bells in rounds, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. But some of the bells are so brutal that you had to pull, to keep the bell up. They got easier to ring, of course, because just like any mechanical thing, if you begin to use it a little bit more, it gets a bit easier, but they were never easy to ring.
One of our biggest thrills has been ringing in the July the 4th concerts on the Esplanade with Arthur Fiedler. In 1976, of course, it was broadcast nationwide, and we had quite a lot of interest in that because people knew there were real bells involved. It's rather unique, actually, to be able to do that, because of the placing of the church in the Esplanade, the shell. you can do it. Very often the bells in the 1812 overture are just concert bells, but this time it was real ones. And that's a great thing. I really am very proud of that. I think this is the most proficient team of bell ringers in the country.
And it's a very unique thing, you know, because the bells are in E flat. They're tuned to E flat, and that's the key of the 1812 overture. And it's the only place I know of in the world where every year the bells accompany that overture. And they're just over the road from the Esplanade. You couldn't ask for more, really, could you? No. Again, people got to know about bell ringing because of that. Two things going in our favor, you know, the bicentennial and the July the 4th.
The bells at the Advent were actually rehung in 1976. The old fittings were in very bad shape. The bells were high enough in the tower that tower motion was a problem for ringing the bells accurately.
There was a bit of a problem because the bells couldn't be taken out of the tower, and there was this old wooden frame, the coffee table I was talking about, which had to be removed, and then a steel frame to be installed. And so with the bells there wasn't much room to move. You know, you've got to be able to put the bells somewhere so you can dismantle the old wooden frame. So what they decided to do was suspend the bells on chains and pull them up, you know, under the spire.
Oh, they hung them on cables. That was bad. The guys were not happy about working with them hanging over their heads. And of course, they were huge cables. I mean, like a crane has, and enormous clips on the turned up end. But they stretch and slide, you know.
So I wouldn't have liked to have worked underneath there, you know, because what you've got to do is all this dismantling and then the installation of these steel girders and all that stuff. And all the time you look and see if they're moving at all. Once the bells at Advent had been restored, we were in heaven, you know, because shortly after that we got a floor put in above the bells. And so we can ring the bells here and very well inside, but the people outside aren't bothered. That was a complete turnaround from the early history of those bells.
The steeple to the Old North had blown down in the hurricane of, I don't know, 1952 or 1 or somewhere, 55, I don't know. So they were a little sensitive about the spire. As we got near a time to being able to swing some of the bells, the question came up, well, what happens if the tower shakes around and the spire falls off again?
The repair work there led to the bells being essentially immobilized. A floor was put in that actually rested on the headstock of the bells. By some miracle, no damage was actually done to the bells. Holes were actually put in the floor to allow all the fittings, the wheels and the stays to stick up through the floor. Sprinkler pipes were installed and they actually went through the wheels of the bells, so there was no way some of the bells could possibly turn at all.
In order to make the bells work, or at least to try them, we had to get that temporary roof or deck out of there. We had to get the sprinkler guys to come and reroute the sprinkler pipes. Had to make some new stays, and of course had to tighten everything. The wooden frame had to lubricate the bearings, see if everything was all right, clear out any other junk that was up there, put on bell ropes, and we did that.
And I raised the tenor, and it was the first time it had been heard, you know, in all that time. Since about 1930, I estimate. And it was just lovely. Wow. You know, it was just lovely. And it didn't fall down.
Everything seemed safe, and I remember once we got a bunch of ringers together, and we actually rang the bells, all of them, and nothing bad happened. And at that point, I went away. My work was done. And other people formed a guild of ringers there and went on with it. And of course, I think a lot of very serious work has gone on there since.
When they were rehung in 1983, I worked with Bill Theobald on the rehanging. He was their senior bell hanger, and he did a lot of work in this country. And he worked with the construction crew and told them all what they had to do, and they were all in their right. Master carpenter, mason.
There was the preservation issue. You know, people wanted to be sure that it wasn't going to be materially changed. The sound of the bells wouldn't be affected. The location of the bells in the tower would stay the same. The fact they were in a wooden frame had to be recognised and followed.
We wanted a steel frame to begin with, and the bells much lower in the tower, but that was absolutely vetoed. So this oak, seasoned oak, was donated. Well, that was more of Jeff's doing.
One of the last things we got was the timber for the frame. And you know where we got it from? We got it from the Navy Yard, because we needed 14 by 14 inch timbers to make the frame, and that's where the frame came from. They were spare white oak timbers for the Constitution. Oh yes.
The bells were stored at the Museum of Science in Boston for 6 weeks while work was done on the tower, and Linda went into the museum to actually attend to the bells, clean them up, and make them more presentable for public display.
I ended up giving lectures to numerous school classes all about the Old North bells and how you cast bells, and what I was doing was covering the tops of the crowns of them all with baby powder and blowing it off because it settles in cracks very differently from creases, and you can tell where they're fine little hairline cracks and where it's just creases from the mold. You have to make sure that the little things are always done so they don't become big things. It's a machine. It's very mechanical. Moving parts, things get loose, make sure they're tight, make sure the ropes are taken care of especially. You use those all the time. And that all the bits work.
To have bells just hanging there dead and nobody ringing them, that's too bad. It's like having an antique pipe organ or a harpsichord and nobody's making any music on it. These things weren't made to be looked at, they were made to be heard. And I like to have all things working again.
To ring changes, you need a group of bells, usually 8, mounted on wheels, an equal portion of fanatically trained pullers, and ropes to join the two.
A tower depends on having enough ringers skilled to actually ring the bells. Change ringing is a fairly obscure activity, takes a long time to learn, takes a fair bit of work and determination to stick with. So it's a hard job to keep a tower going because you need to have generally at least as many ringers as bells, hopefully a few more.
Church bells are not meant to be rung in crowded neighborhoods. They're supposed to be little country churches way out there somewhere, and you hear the bells drifting across the fields, and they're lovely. But if you live in a place where you have apartment buildings, tall buildings, right near the belfry, the sound bounces all around and it just crashes on your ears. I mean, I love it, but most people don't.
It's important that you be good neighbors. Both towers in Boston, we've installed sound control to reduce the sound of the bells, particularly when we're practicing.
You can't ring bells secretly, you know. It's always a public event when you ring these things. I mean, it's bad enough when people, have to practice the violin or the trumpet at home, your kids or somebody like that, and you think, yeah, well.
Over time, I think most people, so long as everyone behaves politely and we make sure the bells aren't too loud and we don't ring them at inappropriate times like the middle of the night, people tend to learn to appreciate the sound of bells.
I got an anonymous note from someone who lives in the area saying, I just wanted to let you know I love hearing the bells, and I listen to them all the time, and I bet you don't get to hear this very often, so I just wanted to say thank you. And it's like anonymous, and it's someone in the area. And it's so rare, because usually all we hear are, why are you ringing again? It sounds awful. Or nothing at all, that we're just taken aback by that. It was very sweet.
There's nothing like fine ringing, and there's nothing like being in the company of ringers.
Ringers in general respect the history of ringing when it's been basically passed on, from one, each generation teaches the next in a very organic kind of way.
People have found a link to other people, and they've found people that they like and who like them, and they'll help each other. It's like an extended family, I think. And it's a huge family, because if you go to another tower, if you poke your nose into the ringing room on a Sunday morning when they're ringing the bells, or you happen to find out that when their practice night isn't show up, the very first thing they will ask you, are you a ringer? And if you're a ringer, you ring with them. And you couldn't ask for more than that, could you? No.
One of the things that I began to enjoy about this was that the whole thing seemed so absolutely indifferent to age or gender. People simply connected to each other basically as ringers.
You're always welcome into other people's towers. You're generally viewed as a big asset when you show up to someone's practice, that you're helping their practice. Or if you're a less experienced ringer, they love the opportunity to help you.
Oh yes, you turn up at a tower in some little English village and they say, "Do you ring?" And you say, well, yes, after a fashion. And they drag you in and make you welcome and drag you off to the pub and refuse to let you pay. And then somebody will take you home for the night if you're lost. You haven't got any place to stay. And you have 8 or 9 or 10 new friends.
One of the great experiences for me has been to go up in our own belfry here or any others and just stand there up above the bells on the stairs and listen to all the bells ring. I mean, it's terrible for your ears, but it's just a wonderful, wonderful experience, I think.
Every once in a while, maybe even just a few times a year, everything just absolutely comes together. And you've got 8 or 10 or 12 people all working together to make a single harmonious, absolutely even sound. And it's absolutely transcendent. I think a lot of people, it's those few moments that really keep them ringing.
If I were to be asked, you know, what were the most important things that happened to me while I was living, this would be one of them. And if I had the choice of being a ringer again, I would take it. Without doubt. It's been a joy. It still is.